Purity amidst madness. Chapter 2. Hate him? No. I couldn't. Suspecting him was another thing entirely. Suspicion was territory I was willing to travel. As we left Limberry, I soon realized that Ramza was probably the strangest commander I'd ever met. Even the youngest of the trio of Ho-Q-10 deserters showed no hesitation in disputing Ramza's plans and threw her own two gil in whenever the mood struck her. Though those three spent the majority of their time searching down other leads for Ramza and thus spent only a small amount of time with the main group, they felt no hesitation in questioning his orders. More troubling was the fact he listened when they spoke every time, even in battle, which ran counter to everything I'd learned about commanding men in the field. Everything he did spoke of a poorly trained commander, one who would lead his forces into defeat. Of course, the fact that T.G. Sid himself followed this raw young man's directions without question, save for the rare times he offered his advice, told me that there was something I was missing. The second evening with the odd group, I sought out Orlando. I wanted to know why he followed Ramza. The young man, he was obviously raw, inexperienced. The hooded man who stood silent at our flank and watched would have been an infinitely more experienced, more battle-tested leader for our band. Why did this man, used to leading thousands, defer to a young man who'd never commanded more than a dozen people? The thunder god smiled at me as I slowly walked towards him, carrying a pair of bowls with some spicy rice dish Rafa cooked. He accepted the dish with a nod, tilting his head towards the empty spot on the log next to him. I took it and had gulped down my first spoonful before he spoke.
So, what's eating you, girl? Are you wondering what sort of man you've chosen to follow, or are you wondering why it's not me that's leading him?
Orlando drawled, causing me to cough as the rice caught in my throat. My eyes met his and saw only amusement there.
Oh, I'm not a mind reader. I had the same question for Ms. Oakes when I joined this merry bunch. Everything she'd told me has proven true. And more. I see something in him echoed in my memories which she couldn't possibly know. Pardon me.
I managed, attempting to demurely cover the fact I was hacking up rice and, in all likelihood, failing miserably. After a moment of silence, I smiled wanly.
I guess I'd like to know the answer to both. I'll start with why I follow him. To be quite blunt, he's right. No matter how it looks on the surface, no matter how much pain it causes him, he always does what he thinks is right.
Orlando admitted, spooning some rice into his mouth. He paused to give me a look.
I'm sure you're aware of the fact that Balbainsbeulve was the only man who ever matched me on the battlefield. In every way, that man was my equal, save one, I was willing to bow to Galdana. Balbains always forced Larg to follow the trail he blazed. Perhaps you could clarify?
I asked shyly. It didn't suit me, I'll admit, but let's see how bold you act in front of your childhood hero. This was a man who'd held a pass against 100 Ho-Q-10 with nothing more than a handful of squires. Let's see how bold you act in front of him.
There were times during the war that Galdana ordered me to use strategies I found dishonorable. Most of the time, I refused. Most.
He repeated, putting a lot of force behind the word.
And though I'm sure Balbains faced equal pressure from Larg, he never relented. Every time Larg's forces engaged in dishonorable tactics, Balbains had long washed his hands of the entire mess. That's why I follow Ramza. Bastard he may be, but he's Balbain's progeny in more ways than his brothers could hope to pretend. Dice Dark and Zalbag were the ones trained to fight like Balbanes, but neither of those men possess the strength of his character. Ramza does possess that strength and more.
Orlando said simply.
Our young leader might lead us into ambushes a more experienced man might have avoided, but he'll never lead us into a battle after which you'll be questioning your conscience. You know, now, what sort of danger Evilise faces. You've been forced to see it, just I was forced to confront Goltana's lack of honor. Ramza, however. He recognized that danger and instead of running when he had the chance, he chose to fight this battle willingly.
Orlando set aside his bowl of rice, resting his hands on the log to gaze up at the dusk sky.
Ramza has gone against the world for the last 2 years out of a simple belief that the state of events aren't right, with no support from his own blood, let alone his former allies. Alone, he's shaken the church, the Nantan, and even the Hokuten. Everyone with power is after him now. He might eventually lead us into a battle we'll have no hope of winning,
Orlando admitted, taking up his dish once more and eating a hearty spoonful of the rice.
On that day, perhaps we'll all die. Then again, he's shaken Evilise to its very foundation. Perhaps we'll finally bring the justice Balbanes strove for to this world. That, my dear, is a goal I'd gladly die for.
I quirked a disbelieving eyebrow at him and did my best to finish my bowl. He flashed me a grin as he ate, the twinkle in his eyes suggesting mischief.
So. You've got questions, but somehow they all pertain to Ramza. If you're interested in the boy, I think there's a fair bit of competition.
He stated without preamble, doing his best to hide his chuckle. I was beginning to sputter a protest when he finished his next mouthful of rice, adding, You know, you're the third damsel in distress he's saved. He takes after Balbanes in that way, I guess. Well, he wouldn't exist at all if Balbanes weren't that way. Competition, for Ramza. I growled, doing my best to inject venom into my voice. It was difficult to do with the burning in my cheeks.
Agrias. Rafa. And you make 3.
Orlando counted off, shrugging as he ate another mouthful of rice.
Actually, now that I think about it, you've probably got the best chance anyway. Agrias couldn't be more married to the field of battle if she slept with a sword at night, and Rafa seems far too shy to actually try for the boy. You, on the other hand, seem to be sensible enough to try to seduce him. You'll excuse me if I'm not interested in a boy who's a few years my junior and so.
My rapid-fire protest trailed off, as I struggled both to contain my outraged blush and search for words.
Dashing? Strong? Heroic, perhaps?
Orlando supplied with a wolfish grin. With a strangled cry I got up, storming off. Well as one can storm off when one has to drop her dish and utensil in the wash bucket first. Glaring at the old man laughing himself sick across the camp, I decided that I needed a walk. It didn't help my mood one bit to hear Ramza politely ask Orlando what was so funny. Igros, ancestral home to the Beolve family, appeared not to recognize the second youngest child of the family as he walked in at the head of our column. In the 2 weeks we'd spent traveling towards the Beolve estate, I'd learned much about my companions. Agrias was ever the stoic one. I could see hints of a woman behind her steely mask, but that's all they were, hints. From what I could see, she was nearly as strong as Orlando himself and twice as aggressive. I knew from wielding a defender myself that the blade was too heavy to swing it around too fast, yet she managed it with considerable ease. Her 2 Saint Kono knights seemed to follow in her footsteps, and I thought it a little odd that the trio of women were probably the hardiest individuals in our group. Rafa and her brother Malik were rarely apart, and both were rather quiet individuals. Rafa was as shy as Sid had told me. Thought I got the impression that Malik's own reticence came about from an indifference towards socialization instead of mere shyness. I got to see their skills in action as well, and was duly impressed. Though the bursts of magic appeared to be random, I saw one hapless thief struck no less than 3 times by Rafa in the span of seconds. Orlando lived up to his nickname in combat, and proved to be a major source of irritation outside of it. I had apparently struck some inner nerve with my reaction to his teasing, because he maintained it with little mercy. Only Ramza's presence would forestall the inevitable jokes and implications, and spending time with the blonde boy meant enduring the old goat's knowing looks. It had taken me 15 years to come to truly idolize the man once I'd started my own training and learned how difficult becoming a heavenly swordsman truly was, yet he tore down that perception in a matter of days. He was a terrible old bastard I'd have been happy to see fall at the hands of the bandits who attacked us on the Mandalya plains, a fate he avoided with a careless chuckle and a blast of lightning issued from his blade. I think he knew how much I was hoping for that, actually. It's the only reason I can see him being caught by the Firaga from the enemy wizard. The young mage managed to cast her spell in record time, but Orlando could have easily dispatched her in that span. His broad smile as he emerged from the flames, little worse for the wear, seemed especially directed at me. 2 weeks had acclimated me towards my companions, but it had also done its work distancing me from the horror I'd encountered within the basement of the Marquis Elmdir's castle. Walking into the Beowulf homestead with my companions at my side, I could almost forget about the monster which had shed Elmdir's armor to attempt to drag our souls from our bodies. Almost. I'd forgotten that I was now standing with Ramza bloody Beowulf. Zalbag and Dice Darg were not known to be especially close siblings. The 7 years between them had apparently been a more difficult hurdle to overcome than most other siblings faced, yet the two had always stood as one where the fate of House Beowulf came into play. Finding them with Zalbag's sword drawn on his older brother as we entered the main hallway should have surprised me. It should have. Yet, I'd known that something was amiss as we entered. Apparently so did Ramza, for he drew his sword without hesitation even before we opened the doors, having identified his brother's chocobo outside of Igros.
Zalbag!
Ramza's cry is equal grief and rage, and I'm surprised that my own hand snaps to the blade sheathed at my side as I hear the whisper of metal on leather around me.
Ramza!
Zalbag's face turns to his younger brother from the balcony overlooking the entrance, and on his face I see depthless regret. He fights back his emotions as one eye turns to the oldest sibling of the 3 present.
You were right, all of it. Dice Dargs fueled this war and killed Lark just to advance his own plans.
A knight behind Ramza's middle brother shifted, and I knew he was about to attempt a lunge with the heavy blade in his hands.
Zalbag, behind you!
Ramza yelled, drawing his own blade and rushing forward. His dragoon training paid off, carrying him dozens of feet upward to start attacking both of the elite Hoku-10 at once. The quickness of either of their blades would have been enough to counter even my own training. Yet Ramza flitted between them, parrying and thrusting without a care as he secured one half of the battlefield alone. Zalbag took advantage of the shift in his position, launching himself at his brother, their clashing magics forcing Dice Darg's 3 remaining knights to stand back. My mouth went dry and my fingers went nerveless. I was used to battle. Traditional combat. Not this. Ramza, by himself, was dealing with two men who would have qualified as blade masters in any unit they cared to apply to, his sword twisting theirs aside and gashing their flanks. Seeing his deadly grace in action, only one thing flashed through my mind. I'd underestimated Ramza Beolv. Horribly so. Zalbag was an arc knight, capable of sapping the strength and ability of his foes just by being near them. Likewise, Dice Darg was a rune knight, capable of matching the abilities of both myself and Agrias. The terror of their abilities was obvious. It was no wonder that they were feared. Yet, they paled beside Ramza's deadliness. The youngest Beolv was combat personified. There was nothing he did that any of dozens of Nantan or Hokyu 10 knights couldn't do, but it was the way he did these things that defined him. A knight's blow lead into a squire's body tackle, as he twisted out of the way of a sword swipe with a samurai's blade grasp and then got behind his opponent with a ninja's stealth. It was beautiful in a way that would have made even the best warrior weep for the perfection they witnessed. It was also horrible, knowing that he'd been forced to learn this perfection. He lashed out one hand, slamming it into the forearm of one of the swordsmen and forcing the blade up the 3 inches he needed to spin under the slash while directing the other man's thrust away from him's torso. And all the while, he had a maddeningly calm look on his face. He was a monster, just like his brothers. The other 3 knights guarding Dice Darg, every bit the equal of any swordsman I'd met save my father's own armsmen, were far too wary to even get close to the combat of the 2 older siblings as magic lashed the ground around them. Yet my eyes couldn't help but stare at the youngest Beolv. Myself, his equal? A small part of me, the part that retained my sanity, laughed in appreciation at the joke. He fought like a man possessed with the spirit of war itself, and had he possessed the abilities of his brothers, I don't know. Honestly, I don't. The raw ability within Ramza frightened me nearly as much as Sol-Lara had. Even as I stood frozen, the blade masters both fell to Ramza, allowing him to secure his brother's rear. He was supposed to be nothing more than a squire. His opponents had had at least a decade or more of the harshest combat and they'd fallen to him. He was advancing and he was going to. A heavy hand fell on my shoulder.
Not like in the stories, is it?
Orlando asked calmly, quirking a white eyebrow at me. He grinned at the confusion on my face.
Oh, the stories always talk about how skilled and magnificent with a sword the hero is. He can slay any man, no matter how much experience his opponent might have. Yet it's different seeing that kind of thing in action, isn't it?
Ramza was now engaging the knights which were on the other side of the balcony. I noted the way that Agrias and her Saint Kono knights moved to support him with an idle fascination.
I fought him, once.
I explained, fighting the urge to sink to my knees. I would not embarrass the Tingel family name. Not by breaking down in combat.
This. I mean, how? How does he fight like this? This can't be human. It's the way Balbain's Beolf fought, when he fought for something he truly believed in,
Orlando finished for me, flashing me a wry grin. He tapped the Excalibur at his side.
You think seeing that boy in battle is a terror? Imagine him with my skills and a magical blade. There's a reason I never went out of my way to irritate Balbain's girl.
Suddenly a glow from Dice Darg's side interrupted us.
Well, it would appear it's time for us to help out,
Orlando noted, his blade clearing the scabbard with practiced ease. He nodded towards the balcony. Where Dice Darg once stood, Adramelk the Fury now glared around the room. Once more, my world was descending into madness. Legends were becoming a reality I must combat. Orlando's reassuring pat on my shoulder was no reassurance at all.